video, we're going to talk about what's new in Mistral 2023.1.0. This video assumes that you are already familiar with older versions of Mistral. The biggest change is that we have a new JSON data format for the output. That will largely be hidden from you because the data is automatically written to the database. But from a practical point of view, it means there is more information, but less actual data. This means that the Mistral deployment will be more scalable, putting less load on your database or your data pipeline. We are including new job total metrics, new IO summary metrics, new network IO metrics, and of course new dashboards to go along with all of those. We've also tidied up the configuration files for Mistral, so now the plugin configuration file has been merged with the Mistral config file, so there's just one config file. And we've also added an option to log data both to the plugin, so to the data pipeline, and to a file at the same time. So you can have data going into, for example, Elasticsearch and to a log both at the same time. We have added Docker Compose scripts for easy installation of Elasticsearch, which means you can get up and running much more quickly. And a few other highlights, we've now reduced the precision of our timestamps in Mistral. They're now 1 second granularity because that's more than sufficient. We've now turned off remote tracing by default. So that means that when you are profiling an application with Mistral, by default, Mistral won't follow applications that launch processes on other machines, either through SSH or through integration with the workload manager. So, for example, by QSub, we won't follow those by default. You can, of course, turn it back on if you want Mistral to do that. Instead, you should rely on the hooks or other scheduler integration in order to ensure that your jobs are profiled correctly. We've also made improvements to the PBS Docker integration and supplied new PBS hook with more events to make that work. So make sure that you do upgrade the PBS hook. You should always upgrade the hooks and integration scripts from the samples when you upgrade Mistral anyway. So let's take a look at that in action. I'm going to first of all take a look at the new Mistral config file. This is broadly speaking the same as the previous version, but there are a couple of changes. The new time frame is now 20 seconds, and you could absolutely make that longer. Because we now include per second mean and max metrics in the trace data, you no longer need to have 1 second time frame in order to get 1 second granularity in your data. So that's one of the ways in which we've dramatically decreased the amount of data while increasing the amount of information. And we'll take a look at that again in just a second. You can now turn on the job totals, which gives you the total amount of IO written out at the end of the job, as well as IO summary. And because we've merged the plugin configuration into this configuration, we've also pulled out the variables that you can add to the Mistral data. So these are environment variables from your job that can be used to tag the data in some way. Here we are logging the username and shell, but you can add anything you want in there, project, application name, and so forth. That's now added in by Mistral rather than by the plugin. We have the existing metrics still in there for turning reads, writes, and seeks and metadata on and off. And then we have the new network settings off by default, but you can just turn that to yes in order to enable network IO. We log network reads and writes at the moment. Please give that a go and give us feedback. We'd love to hear what you think. We still have CPU and memory metrics enabled by default. And then down at the bottom here, you can see the plugin settings. This is the same as what you would have found in the old plugin config file, with the addition of this new option, which lets you log data to file at the same time as logging data to the plugin. So if you want the data to go to two places, you can put that here. Let's take a look at what the new data format looks like under the hood. You should never really need to see this. This is data that goes straight to the database via the Mistral plugins. If you want to look at the old CSV format, we do have a plugin for that, but most people should be using this new JSON format. I'm showing you this to highlight the extra information that you get in here and the new compressed format, which means that we can cram a lot more information into less data. So here you can say, I'm looking at read, the number of bytes read for all mount points, and as well as the total, which is what we used to have, we also have the mean per second and the max per second, which means, as I said before, you do not need to have per second granularity in order to have the mean and the max per second data rate or bandwidth. So let's take a look at that in action. I've started 10 jobs on my PBS cluster, and you can see those running. I had some running just a moment previously as well. So the dashboards, some of them look similar to how they were before, only instead of using the total amount of data for the throughput, we are now using the mean data rate. In the chart at the top, we still have the total in the table underneath. So in this Mistral overview dashboard, we still have file system reads and writes, but the throughput is now bandwidth per second. The same for metadata. And then we have CPU and memory at the bottom as we had before. If I switch to the job detail, so again, we've got metadata. This is the same as before, but we are now using the mean per second metrics. We've got seeks. We still have reads and writes broken down by size. We still have the Mistral performance dashboard. This is highlighting the maximum I/O duration rather than the total as we had before. We've decided to do that because this should be used to find when you've got extremely high latency or unusual behavior, and so the max I/O call duration is a better metric for that. But we do log the mean and total time spent in I/O as well, so you could adapt this dashboard to show you that instead. And we also have this new dashboard, which is the I/O summary. Now this dashboard shows data once the job has completed. So while your job is running, you will not see the data appear on this dashboard. But we have metrics that qualify the behavior of the job in terms of the amount of I/O and whether it was good, medium or bad I/O. Bad I/O are things like small reads and writes, metadata, some metadata operations such as opening a file that closed without being used, or failed I/O is also bad I/O because it wastes the time of the application and the file system. And so here you can see if you've got any jobs that have bad I/O patterns that are perhaps harming the performance of the cluster, harming the productivity of the system, and merit further investigation. I'll be going through these dashboards in more detail in another guide, but for the moment, thank you for listening.